Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. So today we are going to start talking about cellular metabolism. And we're going to start off talking about cellular respiration, but really, if we look at the big picture, we're talking about a major component to the carbon cycle in our ecosystems, where plants need to be able to take in energy from the sun, create molecules from that in the form of glucose and oxygen. Those major products of photosynthesis then end up being utilized in cellular respiration, which is what we're going to talk about here to make energy or ATP for cells to be able to do things. And then the waste products of that cellular respiration, namely the water and the carbon dioxide, get cycled back to the plants in order for them to continue taking in the energy from the sun, to continue making glucose and oxygen so that this whole process continues to work. So when we talk about those nutrient cycles, we are literally cycling or moving the elements around the ecosystem so that your organisms continue to transform what those elements are in the form of compounds that they create or the compounds that they use. Um, but we keep this whole thing working, right? So matter isn't created or destroyed, we just change its forms. And so when we look at what that looks like in an ecosystem, we're really talking about these nutrient cycles. So for the majority of organisms, the big thing that's going on is the movement of that carbon in the form of glucose and then into carbon dioxide to keep this cycle going. So we're going to talk about metabolism in general here first. And photosynthesis and cellular respiration are two of the major cellular metabolism processes that we're going to focus on this unit. So if we're talking metabolism, right, organisms need to be able to break down those carbon-based molecules. Uh, Glucose, although that's going to be what we focus on when we talk about cellular respiration, it's not the only thing organisms can break down, right? You take in foods, you digest them, you break them down into their component pieces, and then those component pieces get used by your cells. And different foods provide different amounts of energy or ATP in what your cells are able to produce from them. So we're going to focus mostly on the carbs, right? The simple sugars, glucose. And when we look at the cellular respiration process using glucose, we net somewhere around 36 ATPs. And note that these are just estimates. Sometimes your cells are a little more efficient, and so they can produce a little bit more ATP than the numbers given here. Sometimes they're a little less efficient, and so the numbers could be a little lower. And those values, those ATP production numbers, can change from one cell to another in your own body. They can change from one organism to another in a species. And sometimes they can even fluctuate in your own cell depending on the environmental conditions of the time. So just be aware of that. But we'll use these numbers as rough estimates for comparison's sake. So if I break down sugars, I get about 36 ATPs. If we break down triglycerides, fats, lipids, oils, then we're talking somewhere on the order of 146 ATPs per lipid molecule. It's a lot more. Break down proteins into amino acids and then break down those amino acids to make energy, and I get somewhere about 36 ATPs as well. Here's the thing. So we're going to use glucose as our way to trace how cellular respiration works. So we're going to talk somewhere on the order of about 36 ATPs being produced. Here's two reasons for why we use glucose as a way to teach you about cellular respiration. One, when we look at glucose, it's a very linear process, right? I'm going to be able to show you from the very first chemical reaction that happens to the very end of all that ATP production. When I look at things like lipids and proteins, they get fed in somewhere down the line. They get fed into cellular respiration in different processes. So glucose allows me to show you the entire process. Second reason is that your body is evolutionarily designed to go after those carbohydrates first, right? They're your source of quick energy. Your body evolutionarily would rather store those fats than have to break them down for energy. And think about why that would be. If you go back to sort of caveman, early human times, food wasn't readily available. You couldn't walk into a grocery store as a Neanderthal and buy your milk and buy your bread and buy your vegetables out of a store. You had to go hunt them, you had to go gather them. And it didn't mean that that food was readily available to you every single day at any moment in time. So your body evolutionarily, when those sugars are in excess, convert them to fats. So you happen to have a really good meal that day, your body's going to backfill that extra glucose and turn it into fat to store. And anytime you take in fat, your body would rather store that. Because when you go to 3 days without any ability to access food, now your body can break down those molecules and get a lot of energy out of it. So it's evolutionarily designed for that, um, which does get us into some interesting medical health consequences now because that food is readily available and you can ingest those sugars all the time. And again, remember what I just said, when those sugars are in excess in your body because you're not needing all of it in terms of ATP production, your body gives yourself a feedback to say, hey, I don't need all this sugar today that I've taken in, so let's store it as fat in case I end up starving in a few days. And yet the reality is we're not generally starving, at least in most developed countries. The other thing is your body can break down those amino acids, but it would rather utilize those amino acids to build new proteins. Everything in your cells are, in terms of structure, in terms of function, the vast majority of that is driven by proteins. So your body would rather take in the protein that you're able to ingest and turn it into new proteins to build enzymes, to build transport proteins across your cell membrane, to build cytoskeletal fibers so that your cells have structure and are able to move materials around your cells, right? Your body wants those amino acids to build those things as opposed to needing to break it down for energy. So, in terms of like a hierarchy of what your cells will use for metabolism purposes, carbs are going to come first, then we'll go after the lipids, and the proteins are usually the last thing. So, if your body is breaking down copious amounts of protein in order to make energy, it's because your body is typically starved of those sugars and those lipids, and so it has to go there. And that's not necessarily a good place for your body to be on a regular basis. Okay, so let's underlie the idea of metabolism with some of the terms we've talked about earlier this year. So remember, metabolism is the total combination of all the cell's chemical processes, chemical reactions, right? And when we look at metabolism as a whole, it's going to be a series of chemical reactions. It's a pathway. So lots of chemical reactions that are often driven by different enzymes. So if those enzymes aren't doing their jobs, that means that I can't do one set of that pathway, which means I'm not going to ultimately get the end goal, which is a really big problem when we look at genetic mutations that may alter the way that those enzymes get produced, or some other environmental conditions, gets too hot, or the pH is off and those enzymes are denaturing. And so that really messes with your metabolism as a result. When we look at your metabolism as a whole, right, we can break those chemical reactions down into either catabolic or anabolic pathways. Okay, so catabolic pathways, remember, are ones that break down those polymers, those big macromolecules, down into their individual monomers. So any catabolic process breaks things down into smaller pieces. If you remember earlier this year, I showed you that little clip of a cat knocking a bunch of cans over, right? Cats break things. So catabolic processes break things down. Anabolic processes build monomers into polymers. So I'm going to take those individual smaller pieces, put them together, and make something bigger out of it. Kind of like the idea of anabolic steroids, right? We use those to build extra muscle. Okay, so catabolic processes break things down, anabolic processes build them. We could also layer on top of that idea the energy requirements, right? So how much energy do I need in order to break the bonds in my reactants compared to the energy that gets released when I build products, right? There's always an energy input requirement, there's always an energy output. It's a question of then what's the balance, right? What's the net result? So remember, in endothermic reactions, that means I need more energy to break the bonds in my reactants than I get back as my products. So I have to input lots of energy and I don't get a whole lot back out. Exothermic processes release lots of energy when we build the products, and I don't require as much energy to go in. So I get a net release. When I look at layering those ideas on top of these major metabolic pathways, cellular respiration overall is catabolic. I'm going to break down glucose into smaller components. And it's exothermic. I'm going to end up releasing extra ATP or energy at the end of the process compared to the amount of energy I needed to put in to get it to go. Okay, so overall cellular respiration breaks down sugars, so it's catabolic, and releases more ATP or more energy than I needed to put in to start the process, and so it's exothermic. Photosynthesis, on the other hand, when we get to talking about that a little later in this unit, we're going to see is overall anabolic because I'm going to ultimately create sugars, and it's endothermic. And so the energy that I capture from the sun is going to be what drives the ability for me to build those sugars. So keep in mind that the overall goal of metabolism is to create and then ultimately be able to store energy. So all the chemical reactions as a whole in your body are coming down to the creation and the storage of energy so that your cells are capable of doing some sort of work, so that I can use that stored energy and do something with it, right? So we're going to take all of that potential energy, that chemical energy that is stored in the bonds of the compounds that we take in our body, rearrange, and use to ultimately create kinetic energy to do some sort of work, whether it's moving materials across your cell membrane, like in active transport, or moving organelles around your cells, right? That's all kinetic energy. I'm taking that potential energy and I'm doing something with it. We also end up losing some of that kinetic energy as thermal energy or as heat to our environment. So just like I can't create or destroy matter, I can't create or destroy energy. All I can do is manipulate the forms that that matter comes in and manipulate the energy forms as well. So when we look at measuring these energy conversions in any system, we're talking living systems here, we're talking about calories. What's the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of a single gram of water by a single degree Celsius? That's the definition of a calorie. Okay, so if I were to put a gram of water into a beaker, how much energy do I have to input into that beaker in order to make that water's temperature on a thermometer go up by a single degree on the Celsius scale? This definition here is a lowercase c calorie. What you're probably used to seeing are calories on your food labels. That's a capital C. So lowercase c is this definition here. A capital C calorie is what you're used to seeing on your food labels as food calories. And that capital C calorie really is a kilocalorie, 1,000 of the calories of this definition, right? So 1 calorie is 1 gram of water, 1 degree Celsius. When I look at the food calories, we're talking about 1,000. So there's a lot of energy that needs to go in to manipulate those food calories. So your body has to do quite a bit of work to burn those calories off. At the same time, those food calories contain quite a bit of potential energy stored in them in order to do things in your cells when you do break them down, which is good news. So how do energy, or I should say, how do organisms get their energy? Well, we break down your organisms as a whole really into these two major categories up here, right? Your autotrophs and your heterotrophs. Your autotrophs are going to use mostly what you guys think about in terms of sunlight for energy. You're thinking of the photosynthesis, right? Autotrophs can also do chemosynthesis, which is what's down here. So they're chemotrophs or chemoautotrophs, where instead they'll take chemical energy that isn't light energy, but it's chemicals often coming out of the earth or from other inorganic compounds that they're able to obtain in their environment and use chemosynthesis to take that chemical energy and convert it into sugars, carbon-based molecules, usually sugars. So autotrophs make their own food, right, for all intents and purposes, either via photosynthesis, which we'll talk about a little bit later this year, or the chemosynthesis, where they're taking those inorganic compounds and converting them into sugars. Organisms living around hydrothermal vents, for example, are chemotrophs. Heterotrophs have to go eat something else in order to get the energy that they need to then produce ATP. When we look at those two major processes of photosynthesis and cellular respiration that we're going to talk about this unit, heterotrophs are only capable of cellular respiration. Your autotrophs use either photosynthesis or chemosynthesis to make their own food. They make the glucose, but they are then going to take that glucose and also do cellular respiration as well. So they can do both processes. That's a really, really big, important piece to this because a lot of kids come in knowing heterotrophs, knowing that they make their own food. We layer onto that the idea of cellular respiration happening in their mitochondria. When we get to autotrophs, they initially jump to photosynthesis. They know that. They know they make their own food. And a lot of kids by this point in the year know that they have chloroplasts. But we seem to forget that autotrophs also have mitochondria and also do cellular respiration. They're not making the glucose at the end of photosynthesis for us to consume as heterotrophs. They're making it for themselves to then convert into ATP. In order to take that glucose and make that energy, they need cellular respiration to do it as well. So autotrophs contain both chloroplasts and mitochondria and do both photosynthesis or chemosynthesis, depending on the organism, and do cellular respiration as well. So autotrophs really are the ultimate organisms in the sense that they can do it all themselves, right? If we as heterotrophs all kind of died off tomorrow and got wiped off from the face of the planet, the autotrophs would be just fine, right? So long as they can continue to access sunlight or the chemicals that they need to do chemosynthesis, and so long as they continue to be able to die off, decompose, and recycle their own materials, they're good. If all the autotrophs died off tomorrow, we're in trouble as heterotrophs because we need them to convert that energy into usable forms for us. We can't do it ourselves. So when we look at the overarching chemical reactions for photosynthesis and cellular respiration, there's an interesting thing that I hope you notice, and that is that they are essentially reverse processes of each other, at least when you look at the overarching chemical reactions. So if I ignore this arrow for a second and just focus on the green one, I take 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water make a single molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen, that's photosynthesis. So I'm going to utilize energy from the sun in order to break the bonds here to build the bonds over here. Autotrophs are the only ones that can go that direction. If I go the reverse direction, so I ignore the green arrow but focus on the purple one, I take those 6 molecules of oxygen plus the molecule of glucose, and I make 6 molecules of water and 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. That's cellular respiration. I take this big food energy molecule and break it down into these component waste products and also get ATP off as a byproduct. This direction is what we can do, but autotrophs can also go that direction. So autotrophs can go both ways. We as heterotrophs can only go in this reverse direction. Make sure you start recognizing and knowing this balanced equation because you will be required to know it. Good news is when you learn one direction, you've learned the opposite. You just have to remember to flip the arrow and know where the energy belongs. So again, we're talking the basics of your carbon cycle. So photosynthesis, taking in the sun, creating glucose and oxygen that become then the products of that process become the reactants for cellular respiration, which gets us ATP out as the energy byproduct. Water and carbon dioxide gets fed back into the cycle for photosynthesis. So we're really moving that carbon in carbon dioxide and glucose. And then we can also talk about sort of a carbon oxygen cycle, that oxygen being moved from oxygen itself through the water. Um, and so that's a major nutrient cycle that we see in ecosystems. And it's really important that we keep this in balance. So remember, the ultimate goal is for energy. So your cells use ATP as its energy currency. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, right? We've got an adenine here, which is a nitrogenous base, your ribose, which is a sugar, and then 3 phosphates, right? It's a modified nucleotide, right? So when we look at macromolecule categories, this belongs to the nucleic acids. I say it's a modified nucleotide because of the 3 phosphates. So a typical nucleotide will have a nitrogenous base, a sugar, and a single phosphate. This has the nitrogenous base, the sugar, but 3 phosphates. And it's really important that we have those 3 phosphates because they kind of almost end up like being compressed springs. That's a pretty common analogy. When we tack those extra phosphates on, we get a lot of potential energy bound up in those bonds there, so that when I break off those phosphates, I get a lot of energy released as a result. And that release of energy means I can go do work. So at this point, we've talked about taking that ATP and creating ADP in a phosphate in order to do work in your cells, like that active transport. Now I want to know, how do I go from ADP from that phosphate? Now that I've used that energy for something in my cells, how do I recycle it? And this is the component that we're going to focus on in this section, in this unit, is how do I take that ADP and that phosphate plus energy that I'm consuming through food, or if I'm a plant, through energy from the sun, and turning it into ATP so that I keep this ATP cycle going. Because just like I can't create or destroy matter, right? I can't create or destroy energy. I've got to be able to just recycle it or change its forms, and that's what we're doing here. So taking in that energy from glucose, going through cellular respiration to break it down into small pieces, gets me this bite-sized energy. If I were to try and break down glucose all at one time, the amount of energy released in that single chemical reaction would be way too much heat production in the release of that energy that you would literally spontaneously combust. So we're going to use cellular respiration as a way to break down that energy stored in the bonds in that glucose and do it in small chunks so that your cells can actually harness the energy and store it and use it, as opposed to just burning up from excess energy release.